The fog in Winmer, on the hill, had a peculiar temperament. It did not merely descend from the hills and marshes as in most English villages, but seemed to seep from the very earth itself, rising ghost-like between hedgerows and gathering in wreaths about the old stone walls. On certain evenings, when the mist was thickest, even familiar cottages appeared strange, as though the village had rearranged itself in secrecy, while its inhabitants were indoors with their fires and tea. It was on such an evening that Miss Jane Marple arrived at Windermere, having accepted a kind invitation from her old friend, Reverend Charles Channing, and his wife Lydia. The vicarage, though modest, possessed that sort of cheerful domestic warmth Miss Marple appreciated. Polished brass, the faint aroma of lavender, and Lydia's sponge cake sitting temptingly beneath a glass dome. Jane, Reverend Channing greeted her, a tall, stooping figure with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. The fog grows thicker every year, or so Lydia declares, quite the business for motorists. Why, only last week, Charles, Lydia interrupted with fond exasperation, Miss Marple has only just set down her bag. Let her have her tea before you begin cataloguing every minor mishap within a 10-mile radius. Miss Marple smiled, easing herself into a chair. It is a comfort to know one may still rely upon you, Reverend, to keep a faithful record of the community's trials. I dare say it helps the parishioners feel their tribulations are not so overlooked. The vicar chuckled, while Lydia poured tea. It was, to Miss Marple, a moment of homely perfection, the sort of English scene one treasures precisely because one knows how swiftly shadows may fall across it. For, in her experience, darkness so often lay beneath the most respectable surfaces. Village talk, the conversation soon turned, as it invariably did in villages, to the subject of neighbours. You'll find Windermere quiet enough, Lydia said, slicing generous portions of sponge cake, though we have our share of peculiarities. Have you met the Redmaynes? They are at Greystone Hall. A most singular place. Miss Marple had not. She listened with polite attentiveness, her knitting needles flashing softly in her lap, for she never travelled without some manageable piece of wool work. Greystone Hall, the vicar explained, is one of those sprawling old houses that seem quite unsuited to modern life, built in the Georgian period, damp as a dungeon, and perched right where the fog gathers thickest. Colonel Redmayne, retired from the army of course, insists upon maintaining it, though I dare say it's more mausoleum than home. Charles, Lydia chided, though not without agreement in her tone. The Colonel is a difficult man, Jane. Gruff, very set in his ways. His poor wife, Clara, bears it all with fortitude, though I fear she is rather delicate. They have his nephew living there too, Henry, a charming young man in company, though some whisper about debts in London. Then there's Eleanor Whitcomb, a sort of companion or housekeeper, who seems positively welded to the place. Altogether, it's not the happiest of households. Miss Marple observed quietly. Years of listening to village gossip had taught her to sift the trivial from the telling. Behind Lydia's polite phrasing lay an undercurrent unease. And yet, the vicar added, the Colonel remains a respected figure. War service, you know, medals and such. He carries himself with authority, though I sometimes suspect he relishes command a trifle too much, even in retirement. Miss Marple nodded. She had known many such men. Leadership in wartime did not always soften in peacetime. An invitation that very evening. To Miss Marple's mild surprise, she found herself bound for Greystone Hall. The Channings had received a last-minute invitation to dine, and insisted she accompany them. It will be good for Clara, Lydia urged. And I'm sure the Colonel would not begrudge an extra guest. The drive was a cautious one, the fog wrapping itself around the motorcar, so that the headlamps seemed to illuminate nothing but a swirling grey wall. The iron gates of Greystone loomed suddenly from the mist, and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires echoed strangely. The hall itself was vast, its facade half obscured, the upper windows glowing faintly. Miss Marple, alighting with her shawl drawn close, felt that curious prickling of the senses she always heeded. Houses, she often thought, absorbed the temper of those who dwelt within them. Greystone exuded an atmosphere of vigilance, as though it kept its own secrets. Inside, the air was heavy with polish and age. They were greeted by Eleanor Whitcomb, a tall, angular woman whose eyes darted sharply over every detail. Her manner suggested that guests were less welcome than endured. Colonel Redmayne is in the drawing-room, she announced, before sweeping ahead with military precision. Dinner at Greystone. The drawing-room contained its master, Colonel Arthur Redmayne, a broad-shouldered man with bristling moustache. He rose stiffly to greet his visitors. His presence filled the space, as though his voice and gestures must command even the inanimate furniture. "My dear Reverend Mrs. Channing and— a guest. Welcome. Sit, sit. Brandy before dinner?" "No." "Very well." Clara Redmayne entered soon after, a slim woman of nervous grace, her eyes flitting anxiously to her husband before settling with relief upon Lydia. She pressed Miss Marple's hand warmly, as though grateful for the company of another woman. Henry, the nephew, arrived late, breezy and apologetic. "Dashed motorcar trouble," he explained, with a smile a shade too charming. Dinner itself proceeded under the Colonel's domination. He discoursed at length on military campaigns, village inefficiencies, and the decline of discipline in modern youth. Others contributed little save murmurs of assent. Only once did his tone change, when he mentioned certain documents from his service days, papers he kept locked in his study. His eyes glinted, and a peculiar silence followed. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, noted Clara's tightened grip upon her napkin, Henry's sudden interest, and Eleanor's watchful stillness. The meal concluded with brandy, of which the Colonel partook liberally. He retired at last to his study, muttering about correspondence to attend. The guests soon took their leave, Clara expressing profuse gratitude for their visit. As they departed, Miss Marple glanced back through the fog. A single light glowed from a lower window, the Colonel's study. Against the shifting mist, the house appeared both spectral and brooding. A death in the night. The next morning, the village buzzed with astonishing news. Colonel Redmayne was dead. Found slumped in his chair in the study, an empty brandy glass at his side. Dr. Lionel Brooks, summoned at once, declared it heart failure. Not unexpected, he assured the household. The Colonel's heart had long been strained. Quick, painless, the end of many a soldier. Yet whispers began almost at once. Henry's pale face as he left the hall, Clara's tears, mingled with something like relief, Eleanor's rigid composure, and young Maggie the maid, who fled to her mother's cottage, speaking incoherently of raised voices she had overheard. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence, her needles clicking. To others, the matter was concluded. But to Miss Marple, certain details lodged themselves uncomfortably in the mind. Why had the Colonel's cigar, laid ready beside his chair, remained untouched? Why had the brandy decanter been returned to its cabinet with unusual haste? And why had Clara looked so stricken when her husband mentioned those locked papers? Miss Marple knew, with that instinct born of long observation, that this was no peaceful passing. The fog around Greystone Hall concealed more than landscape, it concealed a crime. And so, with gentle persistence and quiet eyes that missed nothing, Miss Marple prepared to look closer. The morning after Colonel Redmayne's death dawned damp and grey, as though the fog itself mourned, or perhaps concealed some darker knowledge. At the vicarage, the kettle whistled, and Lydia Channing fussed with the breakfast tray, but even her customary cheer seemed subdued. "Such a shock, Jane," she said, shaking her head. "Though perhaps not entirely unexpected. Dr. Brooks assures us the Colonel's heart was long weakened. Still, to die so suddenly, and after dinner only last night, it feels almost indecent." Miss Marple, who had been quietly buttering a slice of toast, looked thoughtful. "Indecent, yes. Sudden deaths always jar the pattern of a household, but one must sometimes ask whether they jar it too neatly." Lydia blinked. "Why, Jane, what do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled gently and reached for her knitting. It was not her way to proclaim suspicion prematurely. She preferred to let her needles click, and the threads of conversation unwind, until patterns revealed themselves. First impressions. By mid-morning, she walked across the village green. Already the small community hummed with speculation. At the post office, Mrs. Cribbles, the postmistress, leaned confidentially over the counter. "Dropped down like a stone, they say. Pity about his poor widow. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, Mrs. Redmayne might not be quite so grieved as all that. She's had a hard time of it under the Colonel's thumb. Still, death's a solemn thing." At the grocer's, Mr. Pritchard opened that Henry Redmayne, the nephew, would be well pleased. Always short of funds, that one. A rich uncle dying just in time. Well, convenient, I'd say. Miss Marple listened with her customary patience. Gossip in villages was like fragments of a mirror, each piece distorted, yet together they reflected something of the truth. At Greystone Hall later, Lydia proposed they pay a call of condolence. Clara Redmayne received them in the drawing-room, pale and tremulous in her mourning black. Her hands twisted a lace handkerchief until the threads threatened to unravel. "It was so sudden," she whispered. "Arthur seemed his usual self last night. Of course, he complained of palpitations now and then, but the doctor said nothing alarming. To lose him so." Her voice faltered. Miss Marple murmured suitable sympathy, studying her closely. Clara's grief was genuine, yet beneath it flickered an odd lightness, like a prisoner glancing at an open door. Henry entered with a clatter, all brisk energy. "A bad business," he declared. "My uncle always did things thoroughly, even dying. Still, Aunt Clara, you must look to the future now." His eyes gleamed, though whether with opportunism or nervous bravado, Miss Marple could not be certain. Eleanor Whitcomb soon joined them. Immaculate in dark grey, she stood like a sentinel beside Clara's chair. Her composure was flawless, but Miss Marple noted the faintest tightening of her jaw whenever Henry spoke. The house, too, told its own story. The corridors smelled faintly of polish and brandy. The study door was closed, but Miss Marple glimpsed, through a gap, the heavy desk, the glass tumbler still upon it, and a cabinet with its decanter returned too precisely to center. Her mind ticked gently. The Colonel had died in his chair, the brandy beside him. Dr. Brooks declared heart failure. Yet the untouched cigar, the swiftly replaced decanter, small details, yet such were the crumbs from which trails were traced. A conversation with the doctor that afternoon. Miss Marple encountered Dr. Lionel Brooks leaving the hall. He was a handsome man, confident, his manner bordering on genial familiarity. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. "Sad business, eh? Still, we must all go sometime. The Colonel's heart was a poor thing these last years. I warned him often enough." Miss Marple inclined her head. "So you are certain it was heart failure, doctor? Nothing untoward?" His laugh was smooth. "My dear lady, poison and such are the stuff of novels. I assure you, it was a perfectly natural passing." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, though her eyes were very shrewd. She had long observed that those quickest to dismiss suspicion often had their own reasons for wishing it stilled. Whispered hints it was Maggie, the young maid, who provided the first thread. Miss Marple encountered her outside the kitchens, eyes red from weeping. "Oh, miss," the girl sobbed, "I shouldn't say a word, only, there were voices last night. Raised voices, I mean. I was passing the study door after dinner. The Colonel, he was shouting at Master Henry. Said something about disgrace and debts. I didn't hear it all, but I heard enough." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "You did quite right to tell me, my dear. These things weigh heavy if kept too long." Here was a spark indeed. If Henry had quarrelled with the Colonel that very evening, it might explain his uneasy brightness this morning. Yet Miss Marple did not leap to conclusions. One quarrel did not a murderer make. Still, the pattern widened. Observing behavior over the next days, Miss Marple contrived to see each member of the household again. Clara, fragile but composed, spoke often of a new beginning, then checked herself guiltily. She avoided the study as though it were haunted. Henry, impatient and restless, prowled the corridors. Once Miss Marple glimpsed him trying the locked drawer of the Colonel's desk, before Eleanor's sudden entrance made him retreat. Eleanor, watchful as a hawk, seemed determined to guard both Clara and the house's dignity. Yet there was steel beneath her devotion, a possessiveness that made Miss Marple wonder. Dr. Brooks came daily, ostensibly to check upon Clara, though his visits lingered longer than strictly necessary. His attentions were tender, perhaps too tender for a mere physician. Miss Marple knitted steadily, letting her presence fade into the background, while her mind gathered these scraps like a thrifty sparrow lining its nest. Small clues in the study. She noted a faint sticky residue upon the stopper of the brandy decanter, as though some liquid had clung unnaturally. A minor thing, easily overlooked. She also observed that one letter was conspicuously missing from the row upon the desk blotter, leaving an impression in the paper beneath. "Odd," she murmured softly, "how important papers so often go astray, just when they might be most illuminating." An uneasy evening one evening, as the fog thickened about Greystone Hall, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room with Clara and Eleanor. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Henry burst in, coat damp from the mist, and flung himself into a chair. "I tell you," he said sharply, "this business of keeping the study locked is intolerable. There may be documents of mine within." Eleanor's voice was cool as ice. "Your uncle's study is not a gambling hall, Henry. Whatever papers he kept are no concern of yours." Miss Marple, serene in her corner, knitted on. Yet inwardly she noted the flash of fear in Henry's eyes and the iron resolve in Eleanor's. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating. Within the house, tensions coiled tighter. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, had seen enough to know the Colonel's death was no act of God. It was murder, and within Greystone Hall, the murderer still moved, cloaked as surely as the house itself in fog. The days following Colonel Redmayne's death passed beneath a pall of fog that refused to lift. The village might have carried on with its daily routines. The postmistress sorting letters, the butcher sharpening his knives, the children trudging to school. But in every corner conversation broke off, as soon as the Redmayne name was spoken. At Greystone Hall the atmosphere grew heavier. The house seemed to brood, its long corridors echoing with a silence that was not peace but tension. To Miss Marple, such silence was eloquent. It whispered of secrets. Henry's midnight prowl. It was Maggie the maid who brought word to Miss Marple one damp morning at the vicarage. "I seen him, miss," Maggie whispered, twisting her apron. "Master Henry, creeping down the hall late last night. He thought no one was about, but I was cleaning the grate in the small parlour. He went to the colonel's study, tried the lock, then slipped away when he couldn't open it. As quiet as a cat he was, but I saw." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And did anyone else see, my dear?" Maggie shook her head. "Not that I know of." "But why would he go poking about, if not for mischief?" Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "Men in debt will often poke about where they ought not. But remember, Maggie, appearances mislead. Let us not be hasty." Yet within her mind she stored the information carefully. Henry's midnight visit to the study suggested desperation, and desperation, she knew, could lead to recklessness. Clara's collapse. That same afternoon, Miss Marple joined Lydia in paying another call of condolence. Clara received them, wan and trembling. "It is all too much," Clara murmured, pressing her hand to her forehead. "The house, the arrangements, the endless condolences. If only—" She broke off, her eyes glancing involuntarily toward Eleanor, who stood nearby like a sentinel. Miss Marple caught the glance, though she pretended not to. Moments later, Clara swayed, her voice faltering. She collapsed into Lydia's arms in a faint. Eleanor was instantly at her side, commanding and efficient. "She must rest. The strain is intolerable. Please leave her to me." Miss Marple complied, but as she stepped into the fog-laden air outside, her thoughts stirred. Clara's fainting fit might be genuine exhaustion, or it might be guilt pressing too heavily upon a fragile heart. Eleanor's bonfire 2 evenings later, while walking past the hallside gardens, Miss Marple noticed a faint glow through the mist. Curious, she approached and saw Eleanor Whitcomb, tending a small fire in the grate of a disused outhouse. Flames lit at the edges of papers, curling them swiftly into ash. "Good evening, Miss Whitcomb," Miss Marple said gently, appearing as though by chance. Eleanor stiffened. "Merely disposing of rubbish, Miss Marple. Old household accounts and such, nothing of consequence." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes mild. "How wise to keep a house in order, though I have often found that what is deemed rubbish sometimes proves most interesting to others." Eleanor's lips tightened. "In this household, I decide what is of interest." And with that, she thrust the last sheaf into the fire and closed the grate. Miss Marple walked on serenely, but in her mind the flames burned brightly. What documents required such urgent destruction? Only days after the colonel's death. The doctor's defense. The next morning, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Brooks again at the vicarage. He had called ostensibly to check upon Lydia, though Lydia was in the rudest health. "Really, Miss Marple," he said with a laugh, "you look at me as though I were an object of suspicion. I do assure you, I had nothing to gain from poor Redmayne's death." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said softly, "though one never knows what others might assume. You were often at the hall, were you not? And people will always whisper when a widowed lady receives too much professional attention." Choler rose in his cheeks. "That is outrageous. I visited Mrs. Redmayne purely from medical duty. If tongues wag, it is their disgrace, not mine." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking calmly. Yet his defensiveness seemed a shade too vehement. In her experience, innocence seldom required such strident protection. Maggie's revelation that evening. Maggie crept nervously to Miss Marple at the vicarage back gate. "Miss," she whispered, "I must tell you, the night the colonel died, I saw someone in the corridor. I only glimpsed them through the fogged window. A shawl it was, brushing the doorframe as they slipped into the study. Not Master Henry, Miss Tala, and the shawl had a fringe." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Eleanor Whitcomb often wore such a shawl, but she did not speak the thought aloud. Instead she pressed Maggie's hand and sent her safely home. Rising tensions. The days grew darker, the fog thicker, and within Greystone Hall the tempers shorter. Henry clashed openly with Eleanor. "You treat this house as though it were yours," he snapped one evening. "But mark me, Aunt Clara is mistress now, not you." Eleanor's eyes blazed. "I serve this family," Henry Redmayne. I guard it against parasites and scoundrels. That is more than you can claim. Clara wept softly into her handkerchief, torn between them. Dr. Brooks arrived, soothing and solicitous, yet his presence only sharpened Eleanor's disdain. Through it all, Miss Marple observed, to the household she seemed merely a kindly spinster, knitting placidly by the fire. But in truth, every word and gesture was added to the tapestry she wove silently in her mind. The second clue one damp afternoon, Miss Marple contrived to linger near the study. Henry passed by, hesitated, then tried the lock again. Finding it secure, he muttered an oath. Later, when Eleanor unlocked the door to fetch some household documents, Miss Marple slipped in after her. She bent discreetly to the brandy cabinet. There, in the groove of the stopper, she found a faint trace of crystalline powder. She replaced it at once, her face expressionless. But in her heart she knew, poison. The colonel had not died of heart failure. He had been helped on his way. Red herrings multiply that evening. Miss Marple reflected on her discoveries. Each suspect seemed entangled: Henry, desperate for money, quarreling and prowling; Clara, half relieved by her husband's death, bound to the attentive doctor; Eleanor, fiercely loyal yet burning papers and haunting the study; Dr. Brooks, defensive and perhaps too fond of Clara. Each had motive, each had opportunity. Yet which had possessed both the resolve and the cunning to poison a glass of brandy under the colonel's very nose? The fog pressed at the windows, the hall creaked with age, and Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, felt the noose of mystery tightening. The stage was set. The truth lurked within reach, yet veiled by red herrings and tangled motives. Soon Miss Marple knew the threads would draw taut. And then, revelation. The fog had thickened into a white wall about Windermere. On the hill, muffling sound and swallowing shape, Greystone Hall seemed a lonely island adrift in vapor, cut off from the village and from the wider world. Within, the great fireplaces crackled, but the warmth could not dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over its inhabitants. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a wing-back chair, knitted steadily. The household believed her a gentle presence, useful for sympathy and distraction. In truth, she was watching, listening and weighing. The pattern of threads, motives, actions, omissions, was nearly complete. Drawing the threads together, she considered Henry first. His debts, his quarrel with the colonel, his midnight prowling, all pointed toward desperation. Yet Henry was clumsy, impulsive. Poison required patience and stealth, not rashness. Clara, fragile Clara, who fainted beneath strain yet seemed oddly liberated by her husband's passing. Could relief translate into action? Miss Marple thought not. Clara was dependent, hesitant, and accustomed to being directed rather than directing. Moreover, her manner with Dr. Brooks betrayed not calculation but genuine gratitude for kindness. Dr. Brooks himself had raised her suspicions, his defensive tone, his frequent visits, but doctors understood poisons too well to choose a method so blatant as a tampered decanter. If Brooks had sought to remove the colonel, he would have devised a subtler means. And Eleanor, tall, vigilant Eleanor, remained the figure at the center of the web, burning papers, watching the household with hawk eyes, wearing the very shawl Maggie claimed to have glimpsed slipping into the study. Her devotion was fierce, her loyalty absolute, yet loyalty could curdle into possessiveness, and possessiveness into jealousy. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Yes, the pattern was becoming plain. A visit to the study that evening. Miss Marple contrived a quiet errand to the study. The door, usually locked, had been left ajar after Eleanor's inspection. Within, the air still bore the faint aroma of brandy and cigars. On the desk lay correspondence, neatly stacked, yet one envelope stood out, scorched at the corner, as though rescued too hastily from fire. Miss Marple bent, her eyes sharp. The fragment of a military seal clung stubbornly. So Eleanor had not burned everything. The colonel had indeed kept papers perhaps compromising, perhaps dangerous to reputations. Eleanor, faithful guardian, had sought to destroy them. But had the threat of exposure driven her to more drastic measures? Miss Marple replaced the letter and left as silently as she had entered. Clara speaks. Later that night, she found Clara alone in the drawing room, the firelight glinting off her tear-stained cheeks. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "it is often a relief to unburden oneself to a stranger. I wonder, was your marriage as content as others believed?" Clara's composure cracked. She leaned forward, whispering with sudden intensity, "He despised me, Miss Marple, truly despised me. Arthur married me for appearance's sake, then mocked me for weakness. I bore it in silence. But he threatened, only days ago, to cut me off entirely. He said I should have nothing, no allowance, no place at the hall. He enjoyed my fear. Miss Marple laid a hand upon hers. And yet, my dear, you did not poison him. Clara stared startled. Poison? No, I could never. Her voice broke. But sometimes I wished he might simply cease to be. Many have wished such things, Miss Marple said kindly. But few act upon them. I believe you did not. And she was right. Clara was a woman of endurance, not violence. Henry's confession the next day. Henry waylaid Miss Marple in the corridor, his face pale and harried. You're clever, Miss Marple, he said abruptly. You see more than you let on. Well, I'll admit it. I searched the study. I hoped my uncle had destroyed the IOs I signed years ago. But I swear, I never touched his brandy. I wanted his goodwill, not his death. Yet you quarreled with him. Miss Marple observed mildly. Henry flushed. Yes, he threatened to expose me, to ruin me. But murder? No, madam. I have my faults, but I am no poisoner. Miss Marple studied him. The desperation was real, but so too was his fear. He had sought reprieve, not revenge. Eleanor's snare at last. Miss Marple turned her attention fully to Eleanor Whitcomb. She found her in the library, dusting already spotless shelves. You guard this house most diligently, Miss Whitcomb, Miss Marple remarked. It is my duty, Eleanor replied, her voice clipped. I served the Colonel faithfully, as I serve Miss Redmayne now. I will not allow scandal to sully this household. Miss Marple's needles rested. Scandal, my dear. Yet why should scandal arise from a gentleman's natural passing? For a moment, Eleanor's mask slipped. Her hands tightened upon the duster. He kept papers that could have ruined names, reputations. I burned them to preserve his honor. And hers. She jerked her head toward the drawing room, where Clara's faint voice drifted in song. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. So in guarding his honor, you also chose to guard your own attachment. Eleanor's eyes flashed. You know nothing. But Miss Marple did know. She had seen that look before. The look of a woman whose devotion had curdled into obsession. The crucial clue that evening, as the household gathered in uneasy silence, Miss Marple bent to retrieve her knitting from beside the brandy cabinet. There, caught upon the brass handle, was a single thread. Fine, dark wool with a fringe. She fingered it lightly. Eleanor's shawl. The final piece slipped neatly into place. Maggie's glimpse in the corridor. The destroyed papers. The obsessive devotion. The decisive opportunity. Eleanor Whitcomb had slipped into the study that night, poured poison into the Colonel's brandy, and returned the decanter with meticulous precision. She had acted not out of greed, nor for freedom, but for pride and possessive love twisted into violence. Preparing the confrontation, Miss Marple did not move hastily. She allowed the evening to pass in polite conversation, her needles clicking serenely. But her mind was already arranging the scene. Tomorrow, she would ask Clara, Henry, Eleanor, and Dr. Brooks to gather in the drawing room. She would lay the facts before them. Calmly, logically, inexorably. The murderer would be revealed, not through accusation but through demonstration. The truth, once spoken, would leave no refuge. As Miss Marple retired to her room that night, the fog pressed close against the window panes, thicker than ever. Yet in her mind, the mists had cleared. The house beyond the fog was no longer veiled in mystery. The truth shone sharp and unyielding, and soon, all would know it. The fog lifted at last. Pale morning sunlight filtered across the lawns of Greystone Hall, casting the house in a washed, weary light, as though it too longed for clarity. Within, a hush pervaded the drawing room. Curtains were pulled wide, fires banked low, the furniture arranged neatly, as if for company. Miss Marple sat with her knitting upon her lap, serene but purposeful. Around her gathered those who remained entangled in suspicion: Clara Redmayne, delicate and subdued; Henry Redmayne, restless and pale; Dr. Lionel Brooks, his brow furrowed; and Eleanor Whitcomb, upright and severe, hands folded tightly. My friends, Miss Marple began in her gentle, bird-like voice, I have asked you here, because I believe we may at last bring an end to this most distressing business. Colonel Redmayne did not die a natural death. He was poisoned. Of that I am certain. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Clara gasped softly. Henry muttered something under his breath, and Dr. Brooks stiffened. Eleanor alone remained rigid, her face an impenetrable mask. The question has been, of course, who among us could have wished for his death? We have all considered the matter. Some, perhaps, more closely than others. Miss Marple's eyes turned kindly toward Clara. Mrs. Redmayne, you had motive in abundance: ill treatment, humiliation, the threat of destitution. But you had neither the strength nor the inclination. You longed for peace, not vengeance. To act so coldly, to tamper with a decanter. No, my dear, it is not in your nature. Clara buried her face in her handkerchief. half in relief, half in renewed grief. "And Henry," Miss Marple continued, her tone measured, "you feared ruin at your uncle's hands, you prowled the study in search of documents, but your confession was of desperation, not murder. Rash you may be, but not calculating enough for poison." Henry shifted uneasily, then gave a short nod. "A's for Dr. Brooks." She regarded him with mild eyes. "You were perhaps too ready to prescribe, too swift to defend your conduct, but your methods would have been subtler, and besides, your professional standing would hardly survive so clumsy a crime. No, doctor, your fault was indiscretion, not malice." Brooks let out a breath he did not know he held. At last, Miss Marple turned her attention to Eleanor Whitcomb. "And so we come to you, Miss Whitcomb, the faithful companion, the loyal guardian of Colonel Redmayne's household, you who burned his papers. Not quite all of them, I think, and kept watch over this family with a vigilance that bordered on obsession." Eleanor's lips pressed tightly together. Maggie, the maid, glimpsed a figure in a dark shawl slipping into the study on the night of the colonel's death. "A shawl which you wore often." "Later, I found a fragment of its fringe caught upon the decanter's handle. That, I fear, is the final proof." Eleanor's knuckles whitened. "Mere coincidence," she said, her voice brittle. "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "It is the small things that betray us. You meant only to protect the colonel's memory, to shield Mrs. Redmayne from disgrace, to preserve the household's reputation. But in truth, it was your pride, your possessive devotion, that guided your hand. You could not bear to see him mocked, diminished, exposed. And so, in misguided loyalty, you chose to silence him, forever." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. At length Eleanor rose stiffly to her feet. "You speak cleverly, madam," she said, trembling. "But what do you know of service, of giving your whole life to another, only to see him destroy himself with cruelty and folly? He would have ruined them all, Mrs. Redmayne, Henry, even the hall itself. I alone kept order. I alone preserved dignity." Her voice cracked. "Yes, I did it. I put the poison in his brandy. He was weak, vindictive, and reckless. I saved them all from his spite." Clara cried out in horror, shrinking back. Henry stared aghast. Dr. Brooks covered his face with his hand. Miss Marple's expression was grave, yet touched with pity. "My dear love, true love does not kill. You mistook possession for devotion, control for care. And in that mistake lies your ruin." And the authorities were summoned discreetly from the market town. Eleanor, calm once her confession was made, went with them without protest, her head high, as though convinced even in disgrace that she had acted rightly. In the days that followed, the fog lifted entirely, and autumn sunshine revealed the countryside in all its mellow beauty. Yet Greystone Hall remained subdued, its household shaken by the shadow of betrayal within its very walls. Clara Redmayne, though fragile, grew stronger. Freed from her husband's tyranny, she began to walk the gardens daily, color returning slowly to her cheeks. Dr. Brooks, with genuine concern, continued to visit, though now with a careful distance that bespoke propriety. Henry departed for London chastened, his debts still a burden, but no longer a secret. Miss Marple suspected that the lesson would either reform him or ruin him further. But in any case, it was no longer her immediate concern. On her final evening at Greystone, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting once more in hand. She watched the last of the mist curl away from the hedgerows, leaving the village peaceful beneath the fading sun. Maggie, bringing in the tea tray, paused shyly. "'Twas you as saw it plain, miss. None of the rest of us could make sense of it." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It is often the way, my dear. People see but they do not observe. Human nature is very much the same in St. Mary Mead as it is here, or indeed anywhere. Pride, jealousy, possessiveness. All too common, I'm afraid." Maggie bobbed a curtsy and left. Miss Marple poured her tea, added a dash of milk, and sat back with a quiet sigh of contentment. Another puzzle solved, another household restored to uneasy peace. The house beyond the fog had yielded its secret, and Miss Marple, as always, had been its quiet, persistent unraveled lure. Outside, the church bells told the hour, steady and reassuring. Miss Marple folded her knitting away, prepared at last to return to her own beloved village, where the roses would be in bloom, and the kettle ever on the hob. For mysteries might come and go, but human nature remained, a puzzle she would never tire of solving.